Welcome to Jerry Recaps. The story continues. A 5-meter-long giant snake fell to the ground. With its belly sliced open, it twitched around, bleeding, until it went limp, the life extinguished from its eyes. Yuan swung his sword to get the blood off of it. On the ground, a relatively large, bloody mess of wolves and panthers lay dead. They were all prey that Yuan had hunted on the first floor. Heaven-Slaying Star's completion rate increased by 0.006%. The completion rate slowly crawled up. For the past 10 days, Yuan had focused on hunting. It was partly because he didn't want to just waste time while the refinement was being finished, and it was also to increase the Heaven-Slaying Star's completion rate. I guess I really can't level up much on the first floor. Yuan's hunting speed was incredibly fast, but there was a limit to the amount of EXP he could rack up on the first floor. After a whole 10 days of hunting, he was only able to level up once. It was an extremely stunted pace, but he couldn't get greedy and climb the tower. So the only thing he could do right now was wait, while increasing the Heaven-Slaying Star's completion rate. As Yuan was about to continue hunting, the player kit inside his pocket rang. Currently, there were only 2 people who knew Yuan's player number, Hyun and Volcaro. Yuan sheathed his sword and checked his kit. The message was from Volcaro to notify Yuan about the refinement. It was the news he had been waiting for. In the hands of Volcaro, the black crystal had taken the shape of a beautiful jewel. Before an intensely heated furnace, Volcaro stared at the finalized crystal, beads of sweat dripping down his forehead. It's beautiful. The onyx-colored crystal radiated a mystical, darkness-like light. Seeing that graceful light, Volcaro couldn't help but put on a gentle smile. It truly was dazzling, so much so that one would never tire of looking at it. Volcaro remembered having seen an alluring light like this before. I want to complete it. Volcaro started to feel an overwhelming desire to create a fully finished product with this crystal. He wanted not just to refine it, but to create an item that could handle its full power. That was his greed as a blacksmith. Volcaro placed the crystal on a thick cloth and wrapped it up. Volcaro raised his head. The equipment on the wall was vibrating ever so slightly. He turned around to look at the situation. Volcaro grabbed the hammer he had placed off to the side. He gripped it differently than when he was forging equipment. He got up from his spot, limping as he walked outside. It had to be today of all days. Volcaro had known this would eventually come, but he walked on thinking how great it would have been if he had been able to have just one more day. Volcaro went out of his smithy. Hundreds of players marched in rhythm. The slums were in chaos. People who made this place their home, unable to climb to the next floor, hid to protect themselves. The oncoming players were armed with swords and spears, and all of their clothes were decorated with the symbol of Olympus, a tall mountain. In front of this group, a player wrapped in red cloth walked alongside Agamemnon. To be in such a foul-smelling place. Agamemnon frowned at the awful stench that filled the slums. No wonder we couldn't find him until now. Agamemnon stared at a building covered in tattered cloth. As he pointed his hand towards it, the hundreds of players behind him got into formation. Hearing the sound of someone walking with a limp, Agamemnon smiled as he nodded. A rough-looking, muscular man walked out of the cloth-covered entrance. Holding a hammer in one hand, the man wasn't wearing any proper equipment. And the hammer in his hand looked like a standard blacksmith's hammer. You're causing a scene in the neighborhood. What brings you guys here? Surely that's a rhetorical question, criminal Hephaestus. Agamemnon pointed the tip of his sword at Volcaro's neck. After hearing Agamemnon, the players of Olympus that had surrounded the workshop started murmuring. Hephaestus? The blacksmith of Olympus? I heard he refused to make a weapon and ran off with the property of Olympus. There was a rumor going around that their mission was to capture Hephaestus alive. But once this was confirmed by Agamemnon, their faces changed in an instant. How are we supposed to capture a rancor? No matter how many people we have on our side. Hephaestus was the greatest blacksmith in Olympus, no, in the entire tower. And he was a rancor that had climbed to the top of the tower. Meanwhile, the people that Agamemnon had brought were players that hadn't even managed to clear the 10th floor. Though they massively outnumbered him, there was a great difference in power. Fear not. A rancor's power is severely restricted on the first floor, said Agamemnon. What? Did I run off with their property? Hephaestus let out a baffled laughter. Volcaro, or rather, Hephaestus slammed the air with his hammer. The hammer struck against the thin air and created a massive sound blast, shaking the eardrums of the nearby players. It was a deafening boom. Hephaestus's powers made the entire place shake. Now stop making me laugh and come at me. I'll smash all of your heads. His confidence made the surrounding players take a step back. They knew that if they were hit by that hammer, not just their heads, but their entire bodies would shatter. Despite this, Agamemnon laughed at Hephaestus's actions. You're a rancor that got crippled after being punished by the ruler of the skies. Can you really call yourself a rancor while wearing almost nothing? Agamemnon's subordinate took a closer looking at Hephaestus's leg. Agamemnon was right. Hephaestus was disabled. Even when he was walking out of the workshop, he looked like he might fall over at any moment. Besides, Agamemnon gave a signal and the man wrapped in red came forward. We also have a rancor on our side. The man had orange eyes, flaming red hair, and pure white skin. He was wrapped in a red cloth. Chryses. He was a player that had climbed the tower while being sponsored by the high ranker Apollo. He was a rookie that was fairly well known in Olympus. Hephaestus had also seen him a few times. Chryses? Hephaestus's eyes widened after recognizing the man. So you've become a rancor. I didn't think I'd end up fighting against you. Chryses stretched out his hand, forming a crimson spear. Hephaestus muttered to himself. He didn't expect that they would bring a rancor from Olympus just to catch him. If you guys cause a scene here with a rancor on the first floor, the penalty will be nothing to scoff at. Players on the upper floors had their powers restricted on the lower floors. And if they used too much power, even if it was restricted, a penalty was applied to them. Worst case scenario, an administrator would show up to personally intervene in the situation. That doesn't matter. I might be a rancor, but you're a rancor as well. Hephaestus frowned at Chryses' answer. Though he might be using his powers on the first floor, it was directed at Hephaestus, another rancor. So it was true that Chryses didn't have to worry much about the penalty. You guys sure are good at coming up with sly tactics. Hephaestus swung his hammer, finally speaking. Come at me. The hammer hit the air, and fire appeared all around. Even Chryses was stunned for a moment. The fight between Chryses and Hephaestus descended the entire area into absolute chaos. Players started dropping dead everywhere, their cries could be heard from afar. Hephaestus's body started turning hot and red, and he started emitting blue light from his eyes. His massive mana turned into heat, turning his vicinity into a sauna. The tension was thick. Both Chryses and Hephaestus clashed together. The energy released from two rancors clashing together spread in their vicinity, resulting in the deaths of many players. I used to respect you. Chryses' fiery hands grabbed Hephaestus's hammer. You became rancor thousands of years ago, and instead of desiring more power, you followed your creed and wielded your hammer instead of a sword, said Chryses. Is that the only reason why you respected me? Hephaestus said angrily. The hammer heated up even more intensely. It was to the point that Chryses, who could manipulate fire, had to let go, unable to handle its sizzling heat. Arrows and spears rained down, and Hephaestus knocked them away by swinging his hammer. Chryses was impaled by the ricocheting arrows and spears. Holding back his scream, Chryses slowly backed off. Hephaestus swung his hammer down in the direction opposite Chryses. The shockwave created by hitting the air blew players' heads and crushed their bodies and armor. Players screamed in agony. Blood started pouring from Hephaestus's body. It was the tower's penalty. Though he was attacked first, they were players of a floor much lower than Hephaestus. Regardless of the circumstances, Hephaestus couldn't avoid the tower's penalty being applied to him for attacking them. Hephaestus started wobbling. He already had a crippled leg, and now in addition to the penalty, he was having a hard time even standing. Chryses pulled out the arrows and spears that had impaled him before approaching Hephaestus once again. You are attacking someone from a floor much lower than you. The penalty applied won't be light. I had respected the part of you that, despite being a rancor, could drop everything and give up on power for your own creed. There was no aggression in his eyes. Yet he once again wielded the flaming crimson spear in his hands. That's why I don't want to fight against you. Hephaestus's hammer let out a cry. It was a vibration that shook the air. Chryses could instinctively feel that this attack was going to be the climax of this fight. Chryses enveloped his body with fire. It was enough heat to melt the ground. The entire area was filled with Chryses and Hephaestus's mana. The moment Hephaestus limped a single step toward Chryses, Chryses took the form of fire and charged at Hephaestus as if he was a chariot. It was a great collision of mana. Their collision burned all the nearby players to a crisp. Their fire attribute mana burnt the atmosphere into nothing. Agamemnon swallowed his spit. The result is, the flames started receding. As the heat and smoke started dispersing, the aftermath of their collision was revealed. Agamemnon smiled. Hephaestus's arm was slowly turning gray, like stone. That shield. Hephaestus spoke, holding on to his body while it turned completely into stone. It's something you made. The fire subsided, revealing Chryses holding a steel shield with the head of Medusa on it. It's Aegis. Aegis was Olympus's greatest binding item. Not only was it the greatest shield, but it also held the power of the monster Medusa. That's how the worn-out Hephaestus was able to be turned into stone. It might only be a replica, but it's enough to bind you, said Chryses. Hephaestus's entire body had turned gray. As soon as he fully turned to stone, Hephaestus fell over on his side due to his crippled leg. Chryses, who was also covered with heavy injuries after fighting with Hephaestus, backed down after confirming that he is finally down. Witnessing this sight, Agamemnon mumbled while trembling with joy, "It's finally over." There were over 100 fatalities, and Chryses received fatal injuries, but he was still satisfied with the results. Because he had managed to capture Hephaestus, the criminal. Drag him away. Following his order, his subordinates that had shied away from the battle approached the petrified Hephaestus. And that's when a voice interrupted them. "I can't let you do that." A player suddenly jumped in and cut the feet off the subordinates that were approaching Hephaestus. Their ankles were cleanly cut. Agamemnon glared furiously as his subordinates cried in pain, rolling around on the ground. "You bastard! What brings such wretched folks to an important place such as this?" The reckless guy that jumped in the midst of a battle between two rankers and hundreds of players. It was the new player YuWon. He was now standing in front of them. Agamemnon's face relaxed. He didn't care about his subordinates that had just gotten their feet cut off. Instead, his eyes were still focused on Hephaestus. "Oh, so it was you." Agamemnon's nonchalant response made one of his subordinates, who was still fully tense, ask, "Do you know him, sir?" YuWon. "He's a player that recently set a new record in the tutorial," Agamemnon answered. "Does that mean he's a new player?" Agamemnon's answer made all the other players nearby also relax their guard. "I thought another rancor had dropped by." "Hey, kid! Where do you think you're butting in?" In an instant, the tension shifted to mockery. Learning that the enemy that arrived at the scene was a new player, and not a rancor, made the other players all laugh and jeer at him. That included Agamemnon as well. YuWon spotted Chryses among the players that came to bring Hephaestus. "That guy Chryses, a high rancor, is here. To think a fight among rankers will take place in this narrow place," thought YuWon. No matter how great of a performance he had in the tutorial, he was still just a new player that had recently completed the tutorial. Because of that, Agamemnon wasn't even a bit scared of YuWon. "What do you think you're doing?" Agamemnon asked. Despite their mockery, YuWon appeared neither angry nor afraid. Suddenly, Agamemnon could hear a ticking noise inside his head. Though it was entirely his imagination, it was true that time was not on their side. Petrification. That was the effect of the replica Aegis. However, because it wasn't the real deal, the effect of the petrification didn't last long. Especially against an ancient rancor like Hephaestus. If Hephaestus were to start moving again, even if it was Chryses, a rancor, that utilized the item, It was unknown how many more minutes the petrification would last. "What are you waiting for?" Agamemnon asked, raising his hand. "Kill him and bring Hephaestus here. But if he's a new player, we'd also receive a penalty." His subordinates hesitated. In response, Agamemnon pulled out his sword. Agamemnon cut the head off the subordinate standing next to him. His head fell off, blood spraying everywhere. At the same time, Agamemnon started bleeding from his arm. It was the penalty for murdering a lower floor player. What was that about a penalty? Agamemnon made it clear that he was ready to cut down on everyone who didn't follow his orders. "Whoever can kill him and bring back the criminal, I will give them a management position here on the first floor." A management position? Just for killing a single new player? Their eyes filled with greed. They knew that they'd receive a penalty for attacking a player from a floor lower than them, but Agamemnon's offer was too good to refuse. The players started charging in. "I'm going to kill him." "No, I will." Even players on the 10th floor joined in on the attack. Agamemnon was sure that this would be resolved quickly. He thought that there was nothing a new player could do by himself in a battle like this. However, he soon realized that he was mistaken. Arcane sword? Agamemnon wondered. It was a hot, flaming arcane sword that had the joint power of colossal fire, an arcane sword. Yuan cut down the players that charged at him with his sword imbued with fire attribute mana. "Don't get caught in it. Get back!" With a single swing of his sword he had shrouded himself and Hephaestus with fire attribute mana. The players who weren't able to evade it were burnt to cinders. What kind of a skill is that? How is the new player already able to change the attribute of his mana? Encasing a sword with fire mana wasn't something that someone could do simply by possessing a fire attribute skill. To do that, one needed to first master a fire attribute skill, then have enough mana control to be able to change the mana's essence to hold the shape around the sword. The attacks from nearly 100 players were like a giant tsunami. In order to evade the attack from all the surrounding players, Yuan had no choice but to use all of the powers of Cinder Eyes. The skill Cinder Eyes helped Yuan determine the attack patterns of the players. So what? He's still just a new player. The players still did not give up and kept charging. Countless swords, spears, and a myriad of skills descended on Yuan. He endured it by swinging his sword and unleashing it. The rare fire attacks were resisted by the power of Cinder Eyes. For Yuan, who had previously endured Surutra's flames, a lower floor player's fire attribute attacks almost felt ticklish. Yuan kept on slashing the players using a colossal arcane sword. Blood splattered everywhere. In just a few minutes several injured and dead bodies lay everywhere in the slums. Yuan sensed a turbulent flow of mana from behind him. Mana blast, Yuan realized. Yuan quickly stretched out one hand in that direction. He instantly used gigantification and shot a mana blast in the same direction as the enemy attack. Yuan's mana blast swallowed up the enemy's mana blast. The three players caught up in Yuan's mana blast were cooked alive. The players cried out in pain as they got burnt by the huge mana blast. A short silence fell before the players went on an all-out attack against Yuan once again. Yuan was disappointed that this was what Olympus had to offer. So they don't know that numbers aren't everything. Agamemnon noticed Hephaestus's petrified body move slightly. It was a tiny movement, but he was sure. He couldn't drag this on any longer. "You useless bastards. Don't stop. Keep him on the ropes." It was a messy battlefield. Watching the scene unfold, Agamemnon's face froze. "What's going on?" he thought. Another Olympus player's head was cut off. Yuan would not go down. Refusing to let them have Hephaestus, who was knocked over on the ground as a statue, he was a real persistent bastard. "You're telling me that he's truly a new player?" Agamemnon wondered. He had heard that Yuan got first place in the tutorial, surpassing Hagen. He had also heard how he set a historic new record. Agamemnon thought that perhaps a new player that could one day stand shoulder to shoulder with the great rulers of this tower, the high rankers, had appeared. That was why Agamemnon didn't underestimate Yuan. Or at least, he thought that he hadn't underestimated him. The problem was that still wasn't enough. With his crimson vision, he was able to easily read the path of the sword being swung at him. Yuan shifted his chest back, avoiding a sword swing before roundhouse kicked his opponent in the chest. His opponent was knocked away. Players charged toward Yuan simultaneously from behind left and right. Feeling annoyed, Yuan punched the ground. Then, a tall pillar of fire rose up around Yuan. One of the players who reacted too late ended up getting caught in the flames and was knocked away, and the other two players gave up on attacking and took a step back. Yuan maintained the fire pillar because buying time was enough for him. Yuan glanced over at Hephaestus, who was still petrified on the floor. "Hey Ajusi. How long are you planning on sleeping?" Before he could finish his sentence, Yuan quickly turned his head, sensing an ominous flow of mana. A big flaming spear pierced through the fire pillar and slammed right into Yuan, creating a huge blast at the place Yuan stood. Yuan, who had been standing in place, took a step back. It was the first real fire he had experienced today. Yuan wiped away the ash on his face with the back of his hand. If it weren't for the fire resistance from Cinder Eyes and Pyromancy Robe, he would have just been incapacitated. His burnt skin stung. "Sun Shard, huh?" Yuan looked over at the person who had just thrown that attack at him. So he finally decided to get off his ass. Orange eyes, red hair, and clothes tattered from the fight with Hephaestus. The lion that was laying low from being wounded, the rancor Chryses stood in front of Yuan. Chryses endured the pressure that the tower exerted on him. While cauterizing his open wounds with fire, he created another spear. "What's your relation to Hephaestus?" "I'm a customer." Even injured, a rancor was still a rancor. Just by standing near him, Yuan felt like his entire body was going to go numb. Yuan tried not to be hostile against Chryses. Yuan hoped that he wouldn't join the fight until Hephaestus woke up. A customer? He wondered what Yuan was talking about, giving him a baffled look. A customer? Chryses figured that Yuan must have commissioned Hephaestus for an item or a repair. But he couldn't understand it. Why would someone butt into a battle of this scale over that kind of relationship? Yuan exhaled a deep breath. He was trying to create some distance so other players wouldn't get caught up in Chryses' attack. "The moment I let down my guard even a little bit, I'll be burned to ashes." His opponent was a rancor and the right-hand man of Apollo, the ruler of fire, no less. At this point in time, Chryses was still a fledgling that had just become a rancor, but he was still not one to be underestimated. "Let's take advantage of the penalty." Yuan knew that as long as he climbed the tower, he'd have to eventually fight against Olympus as well as rancors. It just ended up happening much sooner than he had expected, but he knew not to panic. If I take his injuries and penalties into account, it should be no more than 5. If Chryses could use all of his powers, this would be an impossible fight. But considering the injuries he obtained during his fight against Hephaestus, coupled with the penalty a rancor faced attacking a player of the bottom floor, I can do this. Yuan's arm started to morph. Like a balloon being inflated, Yuan's right arm increased in size, enhanced by mana. Witnessing his transformation, Chryses and Agamemnon's eyes widened. It was the most powerful skill gigantification that Yuan possessed, and it was also one of the skills that was a symbol of Olympus. So he had quite an extraordinary skill. Gigantification was a skill that only Hercules possessed within Olympus. Countless rancors had sought it out, but none of them were successful. That meant that gigantification was an epic skill that even most rancors didn't have. The flaming spear within Chryses' grasp radiated intense heat. No matter, he's still a new player that only just entered the tower. A sun flew towards Yuan. Or at least that was what it appeared like. Yuan swung his giant hand forward with all his strength to counter Sun Shard. Giantification, Cinder Eyes, and Pyromancy Robe helped Yuan resist the Sun Shard. Gigantification was a skill that had managed to break the armor and defenses of the Chimera Creator with ease. However, it wasn't enough to defend against the rancor's attack with sheer physical strength. Yuan failed to resist Sun Shard and got inflicted with the status effect burn. Yuan's arm was cooked red. The pain from being burned was intense. He had somehow managed to block the attack, but he had failed to come out unscathed. Maybe I should have bought some ice crystals. Yuwon wondered how things would have been had he consumed some ice crystals, like when he fought against Surutra. Though he might have become a bit slower in movement due to the icy aura, he would have at least had higher fire resistance. Well, it was no use wondering about it now. Kaishi's next attack was already incoming, hurling toward Yuwon. The flames took the shape of a wave as they enclosed Yuwon. It was actually closer to lava than fire, but it wasn't truly lava. It wasn't possible for Chryses to call forth lava while his powers were being restricted on the first floor. Though, it might have been a different story for a high ranker like Apollo. I can't seem to catch a break. Yuwon created 3 mana blasts around him. The 3 blasts took a ton of mana, and at Yuwon's signal, they unleashed their power. The mana blasts collided with the crashing fire wave, but all they did was decrease the intensity of the wave's force. The flaming waves crashed directly into Yuwon. He did his best to try and protect his body with his gigantified arm, and resisted the flames by strengthening Cinder Eyes. The whole area behind Yuwon got destroyed by the Chryses' attack. Soon, as the fire died down, smoke rose from everywhere, and burnt corpses of Olympic players could be seen everywhere. Cinder Eyes and Pyromancy Robe, which helped in resisting Sun Shard, also failed. As a result of status abnormality, burn increased to level 2. A string of messages popped up. Yuwon felt like he was being roasted alive. Hazy smoke came off his body, and he felt his legs weakening, making him wobble. The edges of the Pyromancy Robe started burning off. Even though it was an item with excellent fire resistance, it was going against the ranker's flame. He knew that after facing such heavy attacks from Chryses, the penalty that he would be facing would no longer be light. Yellow electricity started flowing across Chryses' body. It was the second stage of the penalty. That's 2. Yuwon thought. Yuwon wasn't the only one teetering from exhaustion. Chryses was also using all his strength to stay standing due to the injuries that were inflicted during his fight with Hephaestus. If I can just last a little longer. Yuwon thought. He blinked once. It was just for a split second, and he thought he had plenty of distance between himself and Chryses. Yet, flick. Cries, who was wavering, disappeared into the fire, and in a flash, Chryses closed the gap between them and punched Yuwon straight in the chest. Yuwon heard his ribs breaking. Unfortunately, that wasn't the end. An explosion occurred at the end of Kaishi's fist, knocking Yuwon up into the air. Yuwon's body flew through the air, slamming into a wall. The hard wall crumbled, and Yuwon was buried underneath the rubble of the building. Pieces of the building trickled down and fell on top of Yuwon's head. He slowly tried to move and winced at the pain in his chest. Maybe I underestimated him too much because we're on the first floor. He might have just become a rancor, but he was still a rancor nonetheless. Even with the restrictions of the first floor, the penalty, and his injuries, he wasn't an opponent Yuwon could beat right now. With Cinder Eyes, the Pyromancy Robe, and Gigantification, Yuwon had thought that he would have been able to at least last until Hephaestus woke up. But that makes it 3. Yuwon got back up while grunting in pain. His bones were broken, but he could still move. It was thanks to the additional stats he had gained from the Heaven-Slaying Star, the strength and constitution he gained from consuming Giant's Heart, and protecting his body with his gigantified arm. Only about 2 more strikes left. Yuwon pictured the rest of the fight in his head. For me to endure that. In the end, Yuwon knew he needed that. In the midst of the rubble of the collapsed building, a faint light entered his vision. Yuwon looked around at his surroundings. This was a familiar location. What do you know? I was thinking about where it was placed. But it was still inside the old man's smithy. There was still a rancor and dozens of players outside. I sure am lucky. Yuwon smiled as he stretched out his hand. It was the pure dark divine crystal refined by Hephaestus. Even after being refined, it was still not a finished product. The penalty? You'll know once you experience it firsthand. That was what the high ranker Apollo had told him after he had received his mission and was about to go down to the first floor. You'll understand how great power flows inside this tower. The penalty from the third attack had started. Chryses grit his teeth, trying to endure it. An intense pressure crushed Chryses' body while high voltage flowed through him. When the penalty ended, Chryses' knees went weak, and he flopped onto the floor. Chryses vomited blood. He couldn't keep his mouth closed. So, this is what the penalty is like. Having never looked down, only up, with the goal of becoming a rancor, Chryses had never properly experienced the penalty. And when he did experience it, it wasn't for something like coming down to the first floor and using his powers, so he'd had no fear of the penalty. At first, Chryses didn't really understand what he meant. What kind of power could make even Apollo, one of the strongest people in Olympus, admit its greatness? But now that he was experiencing it firsthand, he understood. I could perish. The penalty was different from any skills Chryses knew. He tried putting it into words. From the sensation of his existence perishing, Chryses felt something massive intervening. Is this the tower's will to prevent beings on the upper floors from intervening too much? Thank you for your hard work, sir. Agamemnon approached Chryses and bowed his head. Without his help, this mission would have been impossible. It was Chryses who had captured Hephaestus with the replica Aegis, and he was also the one who had defeated the new player that suddenly interfered. This was accomplished entirely through Chryses' help. Quickly transport the criminal. Check for fatalities and treat the wounded. Also, Agamemnon looked towards the collapsed building where Yuan was buried. Let's just leave him be, Chryses interrupted Agamemnon. Shocked, Agamemnon looked back at him. Pardon me, sir. In the future, he's sure to be. He could finish his words, and Chryses continued, the mission is now over. We're the ones that broke the rule of the tower by causing a ruckus. I'd like to avoid unnecessary murder. Agamemnon bit his tongue at the firm response. At the end of the day, it was Chryses who was the one leading this mission. I understand, sir. Then, from within the collapsed building, the rubble erupted, and a cloud of dust fanned out. And from within that mess, a figure appeared through the smoke. It was Yuan who walked out, wielding a sword in one hand and holding the dark divine crystal in the other. A fire lit in Agamemnon's eyes once again. This almost dead shilling is... Halt, Chryses said. Agamemnon shouted back at Chryses, who seemed like he was trying to dissuade him once again. Are you saying we should still leave him be? He's clearly trying to fight us again. That's not it. Chryses shook his head. He hadn't stopped Agamemnon this time around because he wanted to avoid unnecessary killing. Yuan walked out from the cloud of dust. He's dangerous. From within his hand, dark attribute mana, which was rare and uncommon, was endlessly overflowing. What do you mean dangerous, sir? Agamemnon asked Chryses, confused by his words. There was a hidden veil of annoyance on Agamemnon's face as he looked at Chryses. He wanted to capture Hephaestus as soon as possible and finish his mission, but things continued to get delayed. He's almost dead. There's no reason to be afraid of him. Chryses spoke, dark attribute mana is a special case. And to consider him almost dead, though his mana is... It's fine. His patience finally hitting its limit, Agamemnon interrupted Chryses. No matter how talented he might be, he's still a new player. You look very tired, sir. Please have some rest. Agamemnon set his sights back on Yuan. We'll take care of him. It was the strangest thing. Yuan, who was standing in the pile of rubble just a moment ago, had disappeared. Where did he go? The sound of a loud explosion. It was from the direction where Hephaestus was laying on the ground. Surprised, Agamemnon quickly turned his head. The subordinates that were sent to carry Hephaestus back were sent flying like bowling pins. It all happened in an instant, the battlefield erupting into absolute chaos once more. Yuan was once again standing next to Hephaestus. Yuan held his sword in his mouth and grabbed Hephaestus' stone's body. Hephaestus's petrified body continued to slowly twitch. The petrification status effect only stopped one's movement. It didn't stop one's mind. That meant that even now, Hephaestus was struggling with everything he had to break out of the petrification. Agamemnon grits his teeth. What are you doing, you idiots? Agamemnon shouted in fury. Are you just going to watch him? Go kill him. I said I'll give a management position to whoever kills him. Now jump him all at once. Let's go all in together. The players again charged at Yuan with high spirits. Though their individual skills weren't all that impressive, one couldn't ignore the strength in numbers. Yuan tightly gripped his sword, watching the wave of people charge at him. With a sword in one hand and a pure dark divine crystal in the other, he unleashed his mana with all his strength. An instantaneous mana ripple. Where the dark mana passed by, players' heads were cut off, and their arms and torsos withered away. Their wailing cries could be heard from the horde of players. Yuan continued to fight against the ones that rushed at him, bringing out the power of the pure dark divine crystal. With the fragment in Yuan's hand, his mana continuously changed attributes and was amplified. The only ones to notice the items were Chris's and Agamemnon. He had an unbelievable item. Was that a reward from the tutorial? Chris's remarked in amazement, watching Yuan fighting against dozens of players from floors above him. He then looked over at Agamemnon, whose face had turned white. What did I tell you? The tower called forth a monster. Chris's response ticked off Agamemnon. He grits his teeth. He didn't know what was going on. Until just a moment ago, he didn't seem like he had that kind of item at all. This is no time to be impressed, sir. Agamemnon looked at Chris's with fire in his eyes, giving him a death glare. What's wrong? Didn't you say earlier that you guys could take care of him yourselves? So are you saying you won't do anything about this? Agamemnon was shocked. From the beginning, my role was to stop Hephaestus in his tracks. Against a new player, according to the rules of the tower, you guys need to resolve this on your own. Chris's further spoke. Are you serious? Agamemnon spoke in confusion. Chris's smirked at Agamemnon's reaction. It wasn't that Chris's didn't understand how he was feeling. After losing the jackals, if he failed to capture Hephaestus, who was incredibly difficult to find, he'd completely lose ground in Olympus. Don't worry, Chris's said, standing up with a grunt. He clapped Agamemnon's shoulder. I intend on seeing things through. A big drop of sweat fell down Chris's forehead as he continued to walk. He had already reached his limits from suffering the penalty. He looked like he might fall over at any moment from how poor condition he was in. While in the midst of chaos, Yuan kept on slashing the players that came charging at him, or Hephaestus. Yuan spotted the weakened Chris's. And at the same time, he flicked the finger of the hand that was holding the pure dark divine crystal and waved his hand in the air. The fire mixed with the dark mana, creating a black flame that enveloped Yuan. Seeing this made the players that were charging in take a step back. The only one who passed through the fire was Chris's. Seeming unfazed by them, he reached out his hand and held some of Yuan's flames in his palm. Amazing, Chris's remarked, while closely observing Yuan's fire in his hand. Fire and dark. It was already impressive that he was able to manipulate a single attribute, but Yuan was in fact able to control two attributes. Even most rankers were incapable of this kind of mana control. Chris's looked up at Yuan and thought, if such a talent like him joined Olympus, then it would have been really great. Chris's spoke out his mind trying to recruit Yuan. He said, do you have any thoughts of joining Olympus? If equipment is what you're after, I promise to give you something far better than what you commissioned Hephaestus. Yuan shook his head. There's no way that's my objective. And I've already given him my answer to that question before. Yuan referred to Agamemnon, who was standing and watching from the sidelines. What a shame. He knew that it was highly unlikely, but Chris's still asked for the slim chance of being able to recruit Yuan. Because Yuan was that desirable of a gem. Chris's fire swallowed up Yuan's fire, and the black flames near him changed to red. The flames in the area were split in two, half Yuan's dark flames and half Chris's red flames. The two fought each other, crashing head-on. While that was going on, Chris's body continued to be overloaded by the penalty. Are you sure you can keep fighting? Chris's responded with baffled laughter. I never thought I'd hear that from a new player. This was an embarrassing occasion he'd never be able to tell another soul. However, that was only because other people didn't know about Yuan's existence. In about 100 years, I might be able to share today's events with pride, Chris's thought. Chris's flames swallowed up Yuan's flames. All the nearby flames gathered around Chris's. The fire quickly swirled together until it formed the shape of a sun. A scenario came to Chris's mind. You know, I've fought Kim Yuan before. No, really. When, you say? Well, it was right when he had just arrived on the first floor. Chris smirked as he shook his head. He found it funny that he was already thinking about sharing this tale with his friends in the distant future. Who could have ever imagined that a new player would be able to go toe-to-toe against a rancor? Of course. That's only possible if I manage to survive this first. Watching this attack, Yuan mumbled to himself, so he's prepared to perish. Yuan got a sense of how truly important this mission was to them. Of course, that was why they were able to send down a rancor to the first floor equipped with Aegis, even if it was a replica. Yuan started putting more power into the pure dark divine crystal in his grasp. Reacting to Yuan's mana, the crystal wailed loudly. The resonating mana started to grow so much that Yuan's body couldn't handle it anymore. If Odyssey doesn't rejoin Olympus here, the next gigantomachy might not happen. To ensure that it didn't, Yuan had to protect Hephaestus right here, right now. The second gigantomachy, that tragedy, could not be allowed to happen. The two massive energies were hostile to each other. The two different types of mana almost seemed like they were growling as they collided and created a windstorm. Yuan and Chris's simultaneously walked toward each other. Not accepting Chris's action, the tower forced a powerful penalty onto him. The small sun that Chris's created started descending after he gave the signal with his hand. The small sun started to lose its form as it wobbled. Having clenched his jaw as hard as he could, chipped teeth and blood sloshed around Chris's mouth. Still, he gathered the remaining focus he had and recollected his mana into one point. The flames came back together, and the small sun regained its shape. With the last of his mental fortitude, Chris's managed to endure the penalty of the tower. And like that, two beings, one from the highest point in the tower and the other from the lowest, collided. I knew it. You really are amazing. In the midst of the giant collision of mana, Chris's was able to faintly hear Yuan's voice. He knew it. Chris's wondered. A hot and violent windstorm brewed. Some of the nearby players even lost consciousness from the storm. The entire world of the first floor felt like it was howling due to the collision of mana against mana. And due to the aftershock of the penalty applied to Chris's, the surrounding area was already devastated. The windstorm continued for a while. What kind of a ridiculous situation is this? Agamemnon thought. Agamemnon's nerves were on edge. How did their battle go? Chris's could no longer fight. It'd be a miracle if he didn't perish from this attack, let alone continue fighting. A rancor exerting this much power on the first floor was probably unprecedented in the tower's history. Even if he didn't die, Chris's body was probably worn out to the point where he'd no longer be able to use any powers for some time. The area looked distorted due to the heat. The haze created by the collision of the two flames slowly started to fade away. Both of them are alive. From within the haze, Yuan and Chris's could both be seen. Barely, but alive. It was as Agamemnon said. Yuan and Chris's were passed out on the ground. One could see that Chris's was alive from the subtle trembling of his body. Compared to Chris's, Yuan didn't look as bad, but he was in a state where he could only slightly twitch his fingers. Their battle was a draw. Seeing the results, Agamemnon smiled. We won. Though it took a lot, Yuan had been taken down. Regardless of how strong he might have been, there was no way Yuan could do something while his body was completely torn up like this. As Agamemnon was confirming his victory, an attack came from his blind side. He splurted out a mouthful of blood due to the critical attack on his ribs. Did you win? He heard an ominous sound. Hoping it wasn't what he thought it was, he turned his head. And what he saw was a crippled man tightly gripping his hammer, his face contorted in fury. Hephaestus had finally been released from his petrification. It's not over yet, kiddo. It was the sound of air being ripped apart. Hephaestus swung his hammer with ridiculous force. The blast from the hammer directly struck Agamemnon's body. Hephaestus's body continued to turn redder and redder. His mana made it feel like he was a gigantic being. He was physically demonstrating that he planned on ignoring the penalty, daring anyone to challenge him. Every time he exerted power, the penalty accumulated in his body, but Hephaestus continued to relentlessly swing his hammer. It was a show of anger, and that anger wouldn't subside just from whacking the air a few times. The attack struck the air with Agamemnon in its trajectory. Agamemnon stood back up, using one hand to push himself off the ground while blood dripped out of his mouth. Mixed in with the blood that he vomited out were pieces of his internal organs. Unlike the other players, Agamemnon was a player from a relatively high floor. So despite being the first one to attack, the penalty placed on Hephaestus was significantly smaller. "I don't care about the other guys, but I am definitely going to kill you." Hephaestus walked closer to him, hot steam billowing off of his body. Agamemnon couldn't move because of the overwhelming pressure and mana. He couldn't believe he had tried to catch a behemoth like him. "I'm going to die," he thought. He knew these would be his final moments. Agamemnon shut his eyes tight as death approached him from head-on. A powerful electric shock flowed through Hephaestus's body from the penalty. Seeming unfazed, Hephaestus stood calmly in his spot and swung his hammer onto his shoulder. Hephaestus had completely lost his sense of reason. Either that or he knew that he wouldn't perish from just killing a single person like Agamemnon. Hephaestus's hammer rose up into the sky. The heavy ringing of the hammer spread, vibrating the atmosphere. Agamemnon sensed his death. Or he thought he did. The result ended up being different. What just happened? In the absence of an impact, Agamemnon carefully opened his eyes. A large shadow covered his entire body. Someone had stepped in between him and Hephaestus. "You went too overboard." Agamemnon saw the side profile of an enormous man about 3 meters tall. With hands the size of a normal person's head, he had stopped Hephaestus's hammer. The administrator. Even before Agamemnon said it, Hephaestus had an inkling as to whom the gargantuan man that appeared in front of him might have been. The administrator of the first floor. "Why did you have to appear now of all times? Did you think I'd just stand by and watch forever, leaving you be?" Hearing Hephaestus's complaint, the administrator took his hammer and tossed it behind him. After leaving Hephaestus's hand, the hammer fell with a loud thump, creating a deep crater in the ground. "If you want a proper fight, do it up there, not here. This is the first floor." The administrator almost never interfered outside of the test. They left most things to the players, rankers, and guilds of the tower. And usually, when an administrator interfered, it was because a problem occurred during a test. Normally guilds took charge and managed the floors, but right now a guild called Olympus was causing problems. And since this was a problem that a guild couldn't resolve, it was only natural that the administrator came out personally. "I had no intention of fighting." "That's good to hear." The administrator spoke while turning his head. The administrator turned his head. Agamemnon locked eyes with the administrator, and he saw something like the great expanse of the universe within his eyes. "Are you a bastard from Olympus?" said the admin. "Yes? I mean, yes." "That's right, sir," Agamemnon replied. Seeing Agamemnon stutter like an idiot, the administrator thought how pathetic he was. The administrator stretched out his hand. Despite a giant hand coming towards him, Agamemnon couldn't avoid it. He felt that if he tried to dodge it, the administrator's hand would immediately blow his head off. "Pass this on to Zeus. If he does something like this again, I'll come pull out his entire stupid beard again," said the admin. A black mark was imprinted on his forehead. "Yes, sir," Agamemnon replied while backing off. "Don't just say you will. You will have to, no matter what." Noticing the unique mark that resembled a tongue, Agamemnon rubbed his forehead. In the tower, the orders of an administrator were absolute. Still, the administrator planted a mark on Agamemnon's head to be sure. If Agamemnon were to ever meet Zeus, he would relay exactly what the administrator said, including the bit about pulling out his beard. Feeling helpless, Agamemnon looked back and forth between Hephaestus and the administrator. What could he do between these two colossal beings? It didn't take much thinking. With the intervention of the administrator, there was nothing they could do. This fight was Olympus's loss. Hephaestus, familiar with the mark, broke out in laughter. Yuan felt like his entire body had been scorched on a grill. It didn't take long for him to lose consciousness, though he did remember trying his best to not pass out. He faintly remembered what happened afterward. The egg bared its fangs toward the scene. It was a ridiculous message. How could a creature that hasn't even hatched yet bare its fangs? For a while, the egg trembled inside his inventory, as if it really was about to fight. The egg with a purple pattern. He thought he could see something like teeth. They weren't actually visible, but he was certain that they existed. This is dangerous, Yuan thought. He felt goosebumps pop up, something he didn't feel even while directly facing a rancor. Yuan got lost in fear and in thought. Was it trying to protect me? What was the purpose of the fangs that it revealed from inside its hard shell? Or was it trying to eat me while I was weakened? He didn't know the exact reason, but before he could find out, Yuan got another message. Unknown egg returns to hibernation. The egg that had been bearing its fangs for a while fell back into slumber. This message wasn't something that had shown up while Yuan was passed out. It was a message that popped up just now. Yuan suddenly realized that he had regained consciousness. He wondered when he had passed out, but Yuan wasn't able to finish his sentence. He mumbled to himself. A thick voice penetrated his eardrums. Yuan opened his eyes. With his hazy vision, he turned towards the source of the voice, where he saw the blur of a large head. Odyssey. Yuan spoke. Odyssey? You really lack manners, don't you? The quality of Hephaestus's voice really knocked the sleep out of Yuan. His foggy vision soon returned to normal, and he got up and looked around his surroundings. When did you wake up? Yuan asked. Now look here. I should be the one to ask you that. Hephaestus couldn't believe it. The first thing the kid that was passed out asked him was when he had woken up. Though that was unsurprising. When Hephaestus had woken, Yuan had already lost consciousness, so the two couldn't help but be worried about each other. How's your body? I seem more or less okay. Yuan didn't know how much time had passed, but most of the burns had healed up. What about you, Odyssey? Said Yuan. How long are you going to keep calling me that? Said Hephaestus. He usually gets angry when one tries to get close to him. Well, I can't call you Ajama, Yuan said with a straight face. You really know how to flap your mouth. Hephaestus spoke. But you survived thanks to me, so what does it matter what I call you? Yuan was brazen, but Hephaestus didn't really have a good response. He scratched his head because it was true. Yuan was the reason why he hadn't been dragged back to Olympus. Hephaestus was holding himself back, looking as if he badly wanted to say something. Yuan looked closely at him, wondering what he wanted to say. Soon, Hephaestus opened his mouth. Thanks. Excuse me? I said thanks. How many times do you want me to say it before you get it? Despite having only said it twice, Hephaestus got up and started fake coughing. He was clearly embarrassed. Yuan was actually impressed that he even said it twice. He tried pretty hard. The Hephaestus in Yuan's memory was someone that didn't use words to say thanks. He was more about actions than words because that was his life philosophy. My name's not actually Volcaro, Hephaestus said with a serious look on his face. My real name is Hephaestus. I was a blacksmith for Olympus. Is that so? Yuan replied. You don't find that surprising? Hephaestus was clearly shocked looking at Yuan. I am plenty surprised. Are you unable to lie, or can you just not be bothered to lie? Hephaestus let out a baffled laugh after asking his question. He had already guessed that Yuan probably came searching for him knowing that he was Hephaestus. And because of the timing, he had even thought that Yuan might have been a member of Olympus. But I'm now certain. It was a doubt that persisted in his thoughts for a while. Was Yuan a member of Olympus? If he wasn't, it'd be odd. How would he have known how to find him? But then, if he was from Olympus, that'd be equally as odd. Why didn't he try to capture him? Hephaestus originally had no answers for either question, but thanks to this event, he became certain of one thing. Yuan was certainly not your average player. Chryses was injured after a fight with him, and he received a significant degree of penalty. But still, for a new player to beat a rancor in a fight. Since the administrator intervened, Olympus won't be able to immediately come back to try and get me. That's why I rented out a big workshop in the city for a few days. A new workshop. The man that had no choice but to reside in a tiny workshop to hide from Olympus got himself a proper workshop. Hephaestus spoke, looking at Yuan. Favors or misdeeds, I'm someone who always pays back tenfold. Just wait a few days. I'll make you the greatest sword. Though, that didn't affect the speed at which he could make something. Yuan gave a gentle smile watching Hephaestus caring for him. He stood up from the bed and he thanked him for taking care of him and crafting a weapon. Yuan decided to climb up the tower, once he received the sword from Hephaestus. As he walked towards the old man, he stumbled due to his weak body. Go to the hospital first, Hephaestus shouted. The recovery went faster than expected. It was thanks to his high constitution stat and the medicine Hephaestus left him. After sleeping for a whole day, when he woke up, Yuan felt mostly recovered. Yuan's eyes were filled with spirit as he walked out of the hospital room. I'll start the raid. The man from the pure dark divine crystal quickly disintegrated the monsters' bodies. This was due to the special property of dark mana. While trudging through the corpses of the gorilla-like monsters around him, Yuan looked down at the crystal in his hand. I think I can start moving around now. He couldn't remember the last time he had laid down for so long. It had only been a day, but he already felt like his body had stiffened up. I ended up facing a rancor much sooner than I expected. I also thought I wouldn't face Olympus until at least the 10th floor, but things got ahead of schedule. Still, despite my plans being thrown out the window, I gained something huge, so it's fine. Hephaestus finally came out of hiding. With the intervention of the administrator, Olympus wouldn't be able to plan another extreme intervention on the first floor with a rancor like this time. They'd need at least a few years for another attempt, and those few years would be plenty of time for Yuan to bring about change. With Odyssey's help, I'll be able to obtain items much easier. And I also managed to rebuild our relationship much faster than I expected. And more than anything else, this is going to greatly affect the second gigantomachy. Yuan stared at the black gem in his hand. There was no need for him to properly calculate his gains and losses. On one hand, he had refined the black crystal, gained a huge supporter in Hephaestus, greatly influenced the gigantomachy, and put Olympus under the close watch of the administrator. It's surprisingly hard to handle. Yuan thought back to the power of the Helm of Invisibility used by Hades. If the Helm of Invisibility was the sun, the current pure dark divine crystal was no more than a firefly. It might not have been the completed helm and just a refined crystal, but the difference in power was too great. Which means that it's the difference in users. Yuan might have scored a tie against a rancor in his last fight, but that was only because it was on the first floor. And there was also the fact that Chryses was heavily injured from the fight with Hephaestus, along with the penalty. So I can't control this properly quite yet. Yuan checked the status of the dark divine crystal. Pure dark divine crystal is a fragment that holds the darkness of the Genesis. It contains mana with an unending dark property. It is capable of stealth, can change mana to dark attribute, and can summon hell. It was the effect that was the most noticeable. Hell was a word that symbolized Hades, and it was also like the fountain of his power. However, as the limited mark said, Yuan couldn't use all the power of the pure dark divine crystal yet. Still, this gave a proper insight into its true power. The crystal is less of an item that holds power, and it's more of a medium that summons power. Hell. Yuan didn't know what kind of place it was. It could be literally the world after death, or it could be the name of another world outside of the tower. But one thing was for sure. The pure dark divine crystal was an item that extracted power from that world. I am starting to somewhat get the hang of it though. For a whole day, Yuan practiced using the crystal. And right on cue. Hephaestus, come on over. Yuan got a message from Hephaestus, who had changed his name on his player kit. On the outskirts of the city. The workshop with a low ceiling and thin tunnels was filled with heat. It was a pretty decent workshop. It must have cost him a pretty penny. It seemed that Hephaestus had quite a lot of money saved up, but that wasn't much of a surprise. Items that he made were worth at least tens of thousands of points, and he also got a cut of all equipment sold by Olympus. He was probably part of the top 1% of rankers in terms of wealth. "Today's a quiet day," Yuan said after entering the smithy. "You're here?" Hephaestus welcomed Yuan with his usual greeting. Impatient as ever, he immediately brought out the stuff. "Here you go." Hephaestus handed him a small wooden box and a sword wrapped in black cloth. Yuan took them in each hand and then asked while shaking the wooden box, "I get the sword, but what's this?" "Open it." Yuan put down the sword for a moment to open up the box, but there was nothing inside. "Is it supposed to be a prank box?" Yuan looked up at Hephaestus dazedly and spoke. "You idiot. Take a closer look." "But there's nothing inside." When he placed his hand inside the wooden box, he felt a smooth sensation at the tips of his fingers. Yuan's eyes sparkled. Closely getting a feel of it, he could tell the form of the thing. A glove. It was a thin glove made from a special material. It has great mana conductivity. It can be made invisible through the settings. It was made from a special material, and it had great mana conductivity. From those two pieces of information, Yuan could tell what it was made from. "Did you make this with mithril?" "You're quick to tell." Hephaestus let out a joyous laugh. Yuan put the invisible glove on his hand. Because it was literally invisible, the only way to put it on was by using his sense of touch. After struggling to put on the glove, "I don't feel anything." Yuan couldn't feel a thing. It was as if he wasn't wearing anything. He wondered why Hephaestus made him something like this. Not only would it have been a pain to make it invisible, it even used expensive mithril. Yuan didn't have to think for too long. "There's a groove." On the back of the glove, there was a small inset. Yuan placed the pure dark divine crystal into it. The pure dark divine crystal attached itself to the glove. And then the crystal that was emitting a black light soon disappeared with the glove. The invisible glove wasn't a special item. It was to make it more convenient for Yuan to carry the crystal so he didn't have to hold it in his hand anymore. So this was the reason why he mixed in mithril. Yuan opened and closed his hand, gathering crystal's mana in his palm. Despite there being a layer between him and the crystal, Yuan could control the dark mana without any oddities as he liked. This was thanks to mithril's high mana conductivity. "I'm glad I don't have to explain how to use it. I didn't have time or materials, so I just half-assed it, so use it however you like." "I'll use it well." "Say that after you've checked your sword." Yuan nodded his head and unwrapped the black cloth. A matte gray scabbard. The shape and length were exactly the same as the well-sharpened sword that Yuan had requested. "It's exactly the same." Just by unwrapping the cloth and touching it, Yuan could tell that this sword was truly epic. Yuan slowly pulled it out of the scabbard. It was truly an awesome sword. Just by holding it in his hand, he could sense how sharp it was. "You can name it." "Blacksmith, Hephaestus requests a name for the sword." Yuan carefully inspected the sword. The sharp blade emitted its own light. Mithril was a faintly colored mineral, but the small quantity of the dark divine crystal powder had completely tainted the sword black. He didn't want to just name it after its appearance, instead wanting to decide after fully reading through the item description. Yuan looked at his reflection off the smooth surface of the sword. He was smiling slightly. Watching Yuan's reaction, Hephaestus felt boastful. "Have you decided on a name?" Yuan nodded his head. "An onyx blade, specialized for night and darkness. I'll name it Edge of Nightfall." "Edge of Nightfall? Are you sure about that name?" Hephaestus asked. Yuan answered while sheathing his sword, "Why not? It's like a sharp sword of a deep, dark night." Hephaestus couldn't believe it. For Yuan to be so edgy. He thought about scolding him but decided to bite his tongue. "Too bad his naming sense sucks," Hephaestus disapproved. "By Hephaestus's will, Edge of Nightfall becomes bound to you. A sword that increases my combat powers manyfold in darkness, as well as being capable of accumulating mana. This wasn't simply a sharp and durable sword. It was a sword beyond all expectations. It's a weapon crafted by the blacksmith Hephaestus. It's been made using mithril and the remnants of a special crystal. It can accumulate dark mana and increase stamina recovery rate by 200%, mana amplification, and mana recovery by 100%. After checking the effects of the sword, Yuwon's eyes widened. What kind of recovery options are these? A bound item. It seemed that Hephaestus didn't want this sword falling into anyone else's hands. That didn't matter to Yuwon. Without some very special circumstances, there was no way he would sell a sword of this caliber for points. Yuwon fastened the sword around his waist with a satisfactory smile on his face, unaware of what was wrong. As someone that considered a piece of equipment to truly be complete once it was named, Hephaestus was quite discontent. He and the sword go well together, Hephaestus thought while shaking his head and letting out a deep sigh. There was nothing he could do. Yuwon was clearly happy with it. Swallowing his grumbling, Hephaestus asked Yuwon, "What do you plan on doing now?" "I need to go up." There was zero hesitation in Yuwon's voice. Hephaestus nodded his head, knowing that would be his response. "That's what I thought." His face shifted from one that was ready to nag him to one filled with concern. "What do you plan on doing about Olympus?" Hephaestus asked, averting his gaze. He felt sorry. Because of him, Yuwon got caught up with Olympus, and that was a wave too tall for Yuwon, who had just started climbing the tower. So of course he was filled with worry. "What do you mean, what will I do?" Yuwon didn't seem all that concerned. Was it because he didn't know Olympus well enough? No, that wasn't it. There was probably no one in the tower that knew Olympus as well as he. There was a response Yuwon had long prepared for this question. "I plan on taking them down. From all the way up there down to here." He pointed towards the roof of the workshop. No, he was actually pointing to the top of the enormous tower. Hephaestus stared at Yuwon blankly. "Is that so?" He knew from the start when he Yuwon that he was not a normal person. Now, that he faced a rancor and hundreds of high-floor players, he is not even concerned a bit. He really is unique punk who has no fear or hesitance. Thought Hephaestus and then said, "Go, I won't be seeing you out." After exiting the workshop, Yuwon turned around and looked back at the door. There was no farewell. It was just the way Hephaestus did things. Before, Yuwon thought he was just an unsentimental and cranky old man. However, he eventually found out that wasn't the case. Then or now, he really is the same. Hephaestus was a friend he hadn't seen in a long time. And for Yuwon, who had come to the past all alone, meeting a younger Hephaestus was a truly enjoyable time. He was suddenly reminded of past encounters with Hephaestus. When the fight with the outer gods was nearing its end, Hephaestus created a new weapon for Yuwon when he returned empty-handed. Forget adamantium or mithril, the greatest metals, the world had become a place where even iron ore was hard to obtain. So Yuwon wondered what weapon Hephaestus could possibly have made him. But then, Odyssey, this is... Hephaestus had made him a far better weapon than the one Yuwon had previously owned. He wondered where Hephaestus had gotten the materials from. The sword Hephaestus handed him was made from adamantium, and from what Yuwon knew, there was a very small, limited amount of adamantium left in the world nearing the apocalypse. And this adamantium was... Did you melt your hammer? Hephaestus's hand had been wrapped with thick bandages. Yuwon could immediately tell how he got injured. After melting down his hammer for materials, he used his fist as a hammer to forge Yuwon a new sword. Yuwon asked why he did that, and his response was as typical of him as ever. "Don't nag me and just take it already. I'm tired." It was a hammer he had spent his life with. After becoming a rancor, he never put his hammer down, becoming a blacksmith recognized not just in Olympus, but in the whole tower. Hephaestus had melted down that hammer to make a new sword for Yuwon. That was how Yuwon came to know Hephaestus's true personality. Yuwon tightly grasped the handle of the sword at his waist. Out of melancholy, he had a hard time leaving, but he quickly snapped out of it. Yuwon bowed his head towards Hephaestus's workshop. "Thank you for everything." both now and before. There were many types of tests inside the tower. From individual tests where you had to complete a specific mission, to group tests where you had to complete a specific mission with others, and scenario tests where you had to find the answer within a specific story created by the tower. The test on the first floor was always identical. Inside the Colosseum, in the trial's proctor room, a beautiful elf woman was sitting while singing songs. She was the proctor of first floor's trial, which every player had to pass before entering the next floor. Name: Kim YuWon. A new player entered the first floor 12 days ago. A beautiful elf lady with straight black hair that reached her hips checked YuWon's information on her player kit while biting a huge piece of chocolate. He set a historic new record in the tutorial, and his potential is rated as S rank. Shuri was a ranker that was currently ranked in the top 10,000. She smiled while looking at YuWon's picture on her player kit. There are quite a few good newbies this time around. Not too long ago, she had managed to meet a player that was a feast for the eyes, which was something she hadn't experienced in a while. It was a pure blood from Olympus, a direct descendant of the ruler of the skies. That Hargan was only second place. So Shuri couldn't help but become interested in YuWon after she had presumed that Hargan was going to be first in the tutorial. In the first floor testing center, YuWon was the only one standing in the middle of the massive Colosseum. For him to participate in the test alone, Shuri thought. Most players didn't participate in tests alone but formed a team with people of a similar skill level. The reason for this was simple. It came down to efficiency and the level of difficulty. There's only one reason why he would participate alone, Shuri thought while looking down at YuWon. She leaned on the arm of her chair, chin on her hand. So he thinks there's no one who can rival him on this floor. It was a truly arrogant decision, but Shuri didn't think it was a foolish decision. In fact, she thought it was very wise. The stage that represented the first floor, the Colosseum, was the stage where the first floor's test was held regularly. It was also famous for being unbreakable. The Colosseum structure was so durable that sometimes rankers would come all the way down to the first floor to duel. I like that this test is pretty straightforward. YuWon unsheathed his new sword, Edge of Nightfall. The purpose of the first floor's test was to check if one had the power to take down chosen opponents. For YuWon, it was already a certainty that he would pass this test. Was the highest record Sun Ogong's? After checking the Colosseum rankings, YuWon shook his head, seeing Sun Ogong's ranking. It was far above his original one. My previous record was round 12. I think it was a Dullahan that I faced. There was no end to the Colosseum test. Well, to be more accurate, no one had ever seen the end. When you defeated an enemy, the next appeared, and when you defeated that one, a subsequent enemy appeared, and so on. It was an unending stream of enemies. Luckily, you could give up in the middle, or you could move to the next floor as long as you defeated the first enemy. Hargan, round 16. YuWon spotted a familiar name. Hargan probably sent his teammates up first while he continued to re-challenge the Colosseum. That's a pretty high record. Round 16 was a record that rivaled the top 100 rankers. Did he manage to get a higher ranking thanks to the King's Lightning Glove? He'll end up making his way up much faster than I anticipated. YuWon already verified Hargan's skill during the tutorial and in the fight against the Jackals. He actually possessed the qualities necessary to one day stand at the top of the tower and become the king of Olympus. I guess I'll be hearing news of him soon enough. Hargan started climbing the tower before YuWon. YuWon was curious about what floor he might be on by now. I'll see you soon enough. With the message, a door on the opposite end of the Colosseum opened up. YuWon activated his cinder eyes to analyze the opponent. A tall orc wearing heavy armor and wielding a glaive stepped out. The first trial of the first floor Colosseum was an orc warrior. Over 2 meters tall, it was a beefy, shredded monster. It was completely different from ordinary orcs, which were mostly just fat. Not only was it much bigger in size, but its also body was like that of a well-trained soldier. The first floor Colosseum was a test designed to measure one's capabilities as a warrior with the orc warrior. The orc warrior spotted YuWon. YuWon was already approaching the orc warrior, wielding Edge of Nightfall, which he had already prepared earlier. Seeing the sword in YuWon's hand, the orc warrior displayed its bloodthirst. Arcane sword. Around YuWon's sword, mana that emitted a black light started gathering. And in a flash, YuWon's sword vertically passed through the orc warrior's body. A gentle cutting sound. The orc warrior's body was sliced in half, including its armor. The orc warrior's corpse dropped to the ground, and the glaive that it tried to swing at YuWon ended up getting buried in the dust. Heaven Slaying Star's completion rate also increased a bit. With this, YuWon passed the first trial on the floor. With that, the first floor's test was over. For any player with the skills to defeat an orc warrior, the first floor's test was merely a checkpoint that they had to go through. But the true value of the first floor's test was elsewhere. A message popped up for YuWon. Would you like to challenge the next trial? While looking at the entrance of the Colosseum, YuWon replied to the message, challenge. After the second trial started, the orc warrior's corpse turned into black dust and disappeared. Soon after, the door that the orc warrior came out of opened again. The second trial of the Colosseum consisted of 2 warrior orcs. The trial had become twice as hard. However, YuWon was already at the door. At a certain point, Shuri, who was spectating the test, couldn't keep her mouth closed. When she first saw YuWon cut down the orc warrior, she wasn't all that impressed. When YuWon cut down 2 more orc warriors, she thought that was plenty doable, since that was something that even Hargan had done easily. However, as he passed the third and fourth trials, with every round that YuWon completed, Shuri finally realized what she was seeing. Isn't this a historic moment? Her eyes widened, and without even realizing it, she had gotten up from her seat. He's even faster than Sun Ogong. He was the man who had set the highest record in the first floor test. YuWon crashed into the center of the Colosseum. In the 9th trial, a horde of armored skeletons fell over like bowling pins. And just like that, another trial was easily cleared. YuWon had yet to even use a proper skill. Since he was fighting without rest, he was carefully managing his stamina and mana. He's not even cornered by the trial right in front of him. She was sure of it. He's looking much farther ahead. YuWon was fighting against the great beings of the tower. He was trying to surpass the record set by the high rankers. And so, YuWon had reached the 15th trial. While looking at the system window, YuWon replied to the message, challenge. YuWon shot out vibrant red fire from his hands. Cinder Eyes controls Colossal Fire. Colossal Sword, a scorching mana? Wrapped in Colossal Fire, YuWon's sword grew multiple times in size. The brilliant fire in the middle of the Colosseum flew quickly down toward the swordsman in front of YuWon. 2 swords clashed against each other. YuWon's eyes shined. You actually blocked it? The swordsman's blade was on the brink of shattering. To begin with, it wasn't a proper sword. It was nothing more than a completely dull, rusted hunk of metal. YuWon wondered how the swordsman could swing such a large sword so easily. The fight started dragging on. I don't need to drag it out too long. Once again, YuWon gathered up his mana. The flames roared. In response to YuWon's attack, from within the old helm, a blue light flashed from the swordsman's eyes. An unbelievable level of mana started radiating out of the swordsman. Every time YuWon and the swordsman took a step, an imprint was left on the ground. A collision between 2 manas and a fight between powerhouses started. A message popped up for YuWon. Your arm has been imbued with the power of a giant. You have a low proficiency. The power of a giant started buffing YuWon's arm. Your constitution is too low. Partial gigantification will occur. The swordsman's weapon broke under the huge force of YuWon. YuWon sliced the swordsman's chest. He didn't manage to cut him in half as he intended, but it was still a deep slice. The tip of his sword likely cut into the swordsman's intestines. His helmet was sliced open, falling off his head. The helmet rolled away, and the swordsman's face was revealed. The swordsman fell to his knees, in front of YuWon. Almost brunette, dirty blonde hair. A face covered in wrinkles. A single eye. Perhaps because YuWon's sword had reached his head, the swordsman had a bleeding scar on his face. This is my second defeat. That white-haired guy was pretty strong as well. said the swordsman. If you had a better sword, this would have been much harder, Yuan said while looking at the swordsman. You know better than me that even if that was the case, you would have won in the end. The swordsman wore a bitter smile. Yuan didn't deny it. It was definitely harder than a standard trial, but he still didn't find this all that difficult. While on his knees, the swordsman looked up at Yuan. There was a hint of respect mixed into his words. Thanks to you, I was able to once again fight with joy. The swordsman stopped talking. He died with his eyes open. Several messages popped up for Yuan. You leveled up. Your strength, dexterity, and constitution increased by 1. Yuan reached out his hand and closed his eyes for him. Heaven Slaying Star's completion rate increased by almost 5%. With this, Yuan passed the 19th trial. With this, I've achieved the same record as Ogong. Yuan knew he would be able to clear the 19th trial. Finally, the unconquerable 20th trial. The final trial. Even Sun Wukong wasn't able to clear the next trial. A message popped up for Yuan. Would you like to challenge the final trial? Yuan's eyes widened. Yuan replied right as the 30 seconds were almost up. Challenge. That's all for today. If you like the next part of this manhwa, just comment below. Thanks for watching, and please don't forget to like, subscribe and comment for getting epic content on this channel. See you next time.